Gruß. Willkommen in einem anderen Aufregendes video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 10 of my organisational series. In this video I'll provide a view of the US World War II divisions and how they changed in terms of combat strength. To determine combat strength, I'll be using a point system from the Corps Commander set of rules. The point system is based largely on physical attributes of the various weapon systems, such as armor thickness, gun penetration rates, rate of fire, speed, special combat features, and so on. If you wish to investigate this in more detail, feel free to view my videos on Corps Commander or download the rules or game aids. As we progress through the years of World War II, many changes are not organisational but are related to equipment, better guns, better tanks and so on. As I'm using a point system which does discriminate between a 37mm anti-tank gun and a 57mm anti-tank gun, you will see these changes in the points shown. The equipment mix I'll be using is based on as much evidence as I can identify, but a lot of it, I have to admit, is gut feel. The organisations I'm using are mainly sourced from the Nearhorst to TO&Es. However, I did need to fill in a lot of gaps, so I have no doubt there will be minor errors. However, I feel they will still give me a points value which is within the ballpark and achieves my objective. The primary formation I'll focus on is the battalion. Companies will be included where they are support formations or when it is unavoidable. Finally, viewers will need to understand that 100 points of tanks will operate very differently from 100 points of infantry. Thus, comparing tank battalions with infantry battalions needs to be done through a subjective filter. However, comparing a tank battalion in 1942 with one in 1945 is valid, as is comparing a US tank battalion with a German Panzerkraftwagen battalion. This video is dividing the US Army into stages dictated by the campaigns they fought in. Each formation's Corps Commander TO&E will be displayed. There is no need to read this in any detail. The relevant data will be covered in a more simpler manner in the following slides. They have been included so viewers can check if the TO&E are reasonable. The values are in vehicles, guns and multiples of 10 men. Thus, if we look at this example, 3 by T13 means that there are 3 T13 tank destroyers in that formation. The totals are provided for each battalion, that's points totals, with support formations grouped into the headquarters support formations. 3 point values are provided. In this case, first is green, that is in morale quality, second trained, and the final veteran. I'll be using raw points value unaffected by morale in this video, but this is providing a view of what I feel morale or quality should affect a formation if you wanted to look at it in a points sort of manner. This shows a simple breakdown of the division's regiments and battalions. After the formation names, there are two values. The first is the Corps Commander points value, with the second being the value divided by 250. The points value gives you an idea of the combat capability of the formation, with a second value provided for clarity. It must be remembered that while figure gaming points provides a rough way of ensuring force mixes are balanced, they can never be perfect. If one formation is 1,000 points and the other is 1,001 points, it does not mean the latter will win any conflict automatically. As a result, it's best to look at the values several orders of magnitude higher. Thus, dividing by 250 gives you a simpler value when a value is 2 is clearly inferior to a value of 3 when you divide by 250. That's why I divide values by 250, for clarity's sake. As for how accurate figure gaming points-based systems are, I have no idea, but I use points and it seems to work in figure gaming, within a reasonable margin of error. If I was doing this from a historian's point of view, I would use a raw firepower value, or what weight of shot can a formation pump out in a set period of time. The mad minute was an old British musket concept, which they continued to use up to at least World War I. The US started using the concept during the Vietnam War, if not before. Using this mad minute concept, this gives us a good firepower value for a formation which can be used to compare like formations. However, that takes a lot of effort and energy, and many figure gaming point systems use this idea regardless, along with other factors which also affect combat effectiveness, which is not included in the mad minute concept. So, love it or hate it, I'm using a figure gaming points-based system to get an idea of the combat effectiveness of a formation, specifically a battalion-sized formation. The first campaign the US was involved in, at least in Europe, was in North Africa, with the first stage ranging from November 42 to February 43. The infantry division which landed in North Africa is listed here along with supporting battalions. In most cases, an infantry division would have an anti-tank attached formation and an anti-aircraft attached battalion. I must point out the tank destroyer battalions were an anti-tank battalion. If you're interested in the equipment which made up a battalion, feel free to pause and study. If not, then let's move on. The US had issues when they first met the Germans, mainly due to leadership. As a result, their quality was poor in this army list. However, remember, I'm using raw values not affected by morale. This shows the combat values by battalion. As the battalions are all very large, I'll not go into the effort to round up to regiments, which would be the case if the battalions were unusually small. As for figure gaming, the values could be used for megablitz in terms of steps, but for non-figure gamers, just consider the value as an educated estimate of its combat effectiveness, both attack and defence. Just a quick note, the tank destroyer gun battalion was not armoured and classified or consisted of anti-tank weapons mounted on light trucks. However, putting the correct symbol moves us into lesser known symbols, which may be hard to follow, so I'll use the symbol for armoured tank destroyer in this case. The US employed rather large armoured battalions in terms of total size. Let's now move on to the armoured division, of which the 1st Armoured Division is shown here. The armoured division which landed in North Africa was what was called a heavy division, which was organised into armoured and armoured infantry regiments. The tanks were the older M3 main battle tank, so the combat, or medium tank, so the combat effectiveness of the medium tank battalion was low, compared to latter US battalions. The second stage of the North African campaign began in April 43 and ended in May 1943. The infantry divisions fared poorly when they first met the Germans. Part of this was troops facing combat for the first time, but I feel a major aspect was poor leadership. After this initial shock, the US quickly sorted themselves out, and this division in this period could be considered very good indeed. The only noticeable change in terms of equipment during this short period was an increased strength of the anti-tank gun battalions, which was caused by the replacement of the 37mm with a more effective 57mm anti-tank gun. I am uncertain if the armoured division suffered the same lack of quality as the infantry division. I expect they did, but once the US had learned their lessons, they had learned them well, and this division performed very well up until the end of the African campaign. While there was some changes to the structures of some formations, specifically the attached M6 GMC anti-tank destroyer battalions, and some equipment change, this did not affect the combat capacity of this division compared with the previous chart that I showed you. The next campaign the US was involved in was the invasion of Sicily, which ranged from July 43 to August 1943. This was then quickly followed up by the Italian campaign, of which the first stage ranged from September 43 to December 1943. A number of minor changes were implemented for the invasion of Sicily and Italy, as well as upgrades in equipment. The first change for the infantry divisions was a reduction in the non-battalion divisional support formations. On the other hand, the engineer battalion was beefed up and its strength grew as a result. On the other hand, the infantry regimental support formations were also stronger. I suspect assets were moved from the divisional level to the regimental level. The infantry battalion combat capacity did drop, so some assets may have also been moved up from the battalion to the regimental level. The US implemented a new light structure for their armoured divisions. In this structure, the regiments were replaced by 3 combat commands. This duplicated the ad hoc German Kampfgruppen system and worked very well. The division which was sent to Italy was a heavy division, but it was generally deployed as if it was a light division. The Armoured Artillery Battalion lost support formations and as a result lost combat capability, but it did retain its original artillery capability. The Armoured and Armoured Infantry Battalions absorbed the regimental support assets and as a result grew in strength. The US began to deploy self-propelled anti-tank guns about this time. Looking at the Airborne Division, the US did conduct airdrops in this campaign, but never at a divisional level. There were a number of errors made and lessons to be learned, which were learnt quite well. I suspect the Italian campaign was a critical learning exercise. While it may seem the airborne troops were rather weak, this was expected considering the lack of heavier equipment. To make up for this, the troops themselves were of very high quality. The second stage of the Italian campaign ran from January 1944 to June 1944. This was then followed by the third stage of the Italian campaign, which takes us to the end of 1944. The second stage occurs concurrently with the liberation of France, which I will deal with later. The infantry divisions in this stage of the war did not change very much. This structure remained until the end of the war. The Americans basically had found their magic structure and they just stuck with it. The Engineer Battalion lost some combat capability. I'm uncertain what the reasoning of this was. I suspect some assets were being concentrated at corps level. The Light Artillery lost some support assets, but it retained its standard number of tubes. The infantry battalions were getting more support equipment, which resulted in their combat strength growing. The anti-tank battalion was upgraded to the 3-inch gun, but this had minimal effect on its combat effectiveness, at least according to the point system. The armoured division used in Italy operated like a light division, even though it was originally structured as a heavy division. This shows the division as if it was organised as a light division. The armoured engineers were beefed up again. The armoured divisions were equipped with self-propelled howitzer, which increased their combat strength because they were now armoured, but the number of tubes remained the same. The armoured battalions were beginning to receive the 3-inch armed M4 medium tanks, but at this scale the impact was minimal, in terms of points anyway. In theory, the airborne divisions could have been used in Italy, but that did not occur as they were all required for France. In the airborne division, the combined AA anti-tank battalion was beefed up, as was the glider support formation. I suspect this was a result of the paratrooper drops around Salerno, or a realisation the division needed more heavy weapons. We now come to the invasion of France, which can be divided into two stages. The first started in June 1944 and ended in August 1944. This was then followed up by the breakout and pursuit of the German forces in France, which included the invasion of southern France. This started at the end of August and ended roughly in November 1944. This shows the infantry division that was used in the invasion of France. The infantry division differed little from the divisions which fought in Italy. As can be seen by this, there was no combat strength changes compared with the divisions which fought in Italy, even though new equipment was being received by the infantry divisions. When we moved to the armoured division, no major changes occurred with the armoured divisions. 3-inch armed M4s were beginning to arrive, but not in large numbers in June 1944. As with the infantry division, there was no changes in combat strengths of the armoured division as compared with the armoured divisions which fought in Italy. After the initial airborne drops, there was a lack of airborne targets, and the airborne divisions needed to be used in the front line, which required more heavy weapons. When deployed in the front lines, these divisions were often well equipped with attached battalions. When we look at the airborne division, there was no changes to combat strengths compared to the airborne divisions used in Italy. This was the division which was used at D-Day and the Arnhem drops. We now move to a bit of an unusual stage, which was the German counterattack and its defeat, lasting from December 44 and ending in February 1945. During 1945, both the Italian and German campaigns would be merged into a single section. So while the Germans were being forced back in the Ardennes, the Italian campaign entered its final stage, ending in May 1945. After the German counterattack at Ardennes had been defeated, the Western Allies launched Operation Plunder, which took the Allies all the way into the western part of Germany, ending the war in May 1945. When we look at the infantry divisions, possibly the biggest change in the infantry divisions were in terms of experience and quality. By January 1945, most divisions were veteran. When we look at the specific battalions, the 3-inch anti-tank battalions were receiving new ammunition in increasing numbers, which increased its combat effectiveness. This was, of course, the HVAP rounds. The tank battalions were beginning to be mainly equipped with 3-inch M4 medium tanks, using these new rounds, also increasing their combat effectiveness. One benefit of using a point system is factors such as new ammunition can be reflected. When we look at the Armoured Division, the biggest change was in new equipment such as the M24 light tank and the M36 GMC. The introduction of the new M24 light tank, increasing proportion of 3-inch armed M4 medium tanks, and improved ammunition boosted the tank battalion's strengths dramatically. These formations were formidable indeed. The tank destroyers also received a boost with the introduction of the new M36 GMC. In 1945, the airborne divisions were significantly beefed up so they could be deployed in the front line. The engineer and glider infantry all received new equipment. I can't help but feel this was a misuse of these formations, but I suppose by March 1945 there was little opportunity of using them in their intended roles. Within the airborne division, the divisional support received additional equipment, as did the infantry, both paratrooper and glider troops, and this is reflected in their combat strengths. Let's now look at how the divisions changed over the length of the war, so you can get an idea of how the combat strengths went up and down. Let's start looking at the changes to the infantry division. What this shows here is each row represents one of the periods that we've currently gone over. We can see that this formation remained rather stable for the entire war. The biggest change were in the often attached anti-tank battalions. On the other hand, when we look at the armoured divisions, we can see a major change when the division was restructured into its light form. When this occurred, the armoured and armoured infantry battalions became much more powerful. It must be pointed out, 2 armoured divisions did retain their heavy structure. Apart from this, the main changes was the increased effectiveness of the armoured engineers, the full adoption of the self-propelled howitzer, and the introduction of superior tanks and ammunition in late 1944 and 1945. All these things had a reasonably significant impact on combat strengths. When we look at the airborne division, they experienced the biggest change in 1945 when they were equipped with more heavy equipment. This occurred because they were beginning to be used as standard non-airborne troops, which, as I indicated before, does seem like a bit of waste of their use. The US Army was possibly one of the easiest major powers to perform this analysis on. I expect to follow up with other combatants and then do a series on comparing the formations within each major period. Thus I will be able to both compare how formations were or have developed within an army and compare the opposing formations. And so this concludes episode 10 of my video series on organisation, in this case analysing the US Army in World War II in terms of how their division combat power changed with time. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.